Hey, FirstSF, welcome back to our Holy Week devotionals in Isaiah 53 that we've been looking at this week. Earlier this week, Pastor Ben led us to see how in Isaiah 53, Jesus was revealed as God's arm of salvation, as Isaiah says, but was rejected by men. And then yesterday, we looked at how all of us rejected him, and not only that, but we wandered away like sheep. And today we're going to look at Jesus' suffering for us and the suffering that he endured in our place. We're going to continue here in Isaiah 53 in verses 3 to 5. We're told in Isaiah 53, 3 to 5, he was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And as one from whom men hid their faces, he was despised and we esteemed him not. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was a chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we're healed. And one of the main things we see in these verses is that Jesus was afflicted with suffering. There's this parallel nature of these first two verses we read in verses 3 and 4, where we're told that he was a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief, and so we esteemed him as nothing, no former beauty or majesty. And then the very next verse, we're told that he bore our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we still esteemed him as cursed by God, afflicted by him. And so you see there's this parallel nature of repetition of sorrows, grief, and esteemed in both verses 3 and 4. And there's some question over what do these sorrows and griefs refer to? What do they mean? Some translators will, and commentators will say that it's our sufferings, whether spiritual over sin or physical sufferings. But other translations that you may see actually translate these in a more sickness or illness sense, where it's literally pain and sickness or suffering and illness. These are words that could refer to the physically afflicted in the Old Testament, especially combined with that term smitten, struck, afflicted. This was especially the case for those who were struck by leprosy in the Old Testament. And it revealed how there was a physical aspect to their suffering in their time. Even the way the language around esteemed reveals some of this, that because Jesus was afflicted with pain and illness, we esteemed him as nothing. And even though it was our pains and sicknesses he was bearing, we esteemed him as still under God's curse. And this is consistent with what we see in the Old Testament, where often in the ancient world, they saw that those who were under physical illnesses and sufferings and sicknesses, it was because of the curse of God or the gods, depending on their religion. Their physical suffering was a sign of the spiritual reality, that those who were sick and suffering because of it, there was something they had done, something wrong about them. The same language is used of Job when he is afflicted with boils, and then his friends tell him, you must be under God's curse. And so the reason that Israel then, and even in the New Testament, as the New Testament looks at Jesus, that they thought of him as under God's curse was because of these physical sufferings that he endured. And to be quite frank, I think in our modern times, we often view things the same way. We have a very cause and effect relationship when it comes to physical suffering. So if someone is suffering physically, it's usually a result of their poor health choices or bad decisions or bad eating habits. If someone is suffering financially or circumstantially, well, it's because of the poor life decisions they've made in the past. They're under some sort of curse that they deserve. And this was how the New Testament world thought about Jesus. When he was under the Roman oppressive government, under the punishment by Pilate and under the Roman government, he suffered this death on a cross reserved for criminals because he deserved it, because he was an insurrectionist worse than Barabbas, who was released for him because of the turmoil he was bringing in the Jewish world and the Jewish order of law. And I think that's the same way, if we were in their times, the same way we would view Christ. We would have viewed him as someone deserving of this punishment. That's what Isaiah 53 tells us. And yet, Isaiah 53 tells us that all of the physical suffering Jesus endured, it wasn't because he deserved it, rather it was because of us. It was the physical suffering that was meant for us that we deserved. In verse 4, we're told that he bore our griefs. He carried our sorrows. That he was pierced for our transgressions in verse 5. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was a chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. There's this constant language of the exchange that all that Jesus endured was actually reserved for us, and that everything that we deserved was then placed on Christ. Though we were the ones that deserved to be under God's curse, Jesus was placed under it. All that Jesus physically endured at the cross, if we think about the New Testament picture of Jesus suffering on the cross, that was all a physical demonstration of the spiritual reality that was happening. When Jesus was lacerated with wounds by the whips and the Roman guards, when he was nailed to the cross, when he suffered there on the cross, that was all a sign of what was happening spiritually. And I think for us now, we can consider this, that for us today, all of the physical sufferings that we see around us, that we endure, what Isaiah is saying is that all of that is a sign of the spiritual reality around us, of the sin and the effects of sin, both in us and around us. It's a sign that the sin that we committed and all the punishment we deserve, well, the physical world is an inbreaking sign of that spiritual reality. And yet, because of Christ taking our place in that suffering, it's a reminder that all the physical suffering we endure today, it's no longer emblematic or symbolic of the spiritual curse that we deserve. And so when we face suffering today, when we're under physical illness or stress, when we feel like we're in a situation that we really want to get out of or we want salvation from, there may be times where we think and it feels like we're under God's curse. And in those moments, we can be reminded that Jesus took our place in that all of the physical suffering we endure now, it's no longer a sign of a spiritual curse of God over us, that it's no longer a sign that God is against us in any way, but rather that Jesus took all of that on himself. And so even when we suffer physically, we can look to the cross as that physical demonstration where Christ dealt with physically the spiritual reality of the curse that we were under God. And so when whatever suffering we're facing, whatever sign of sin we see in our lives that bears itself physically, we can be reminded that because Jesus took our place, he suffered the physical punishment that signified the spiritual reality. We have freedom from the spiritual curse. We know that as bad as things may feel like or be on this earth, because of Christ, the spiritual reality is gone. It's absolved, that there is no more spiritual punishment that we're under. And as bad as it may get here, it's the worst it will ever be, because those who are in Christ, we have been healed by his wounds. We have peace with God. And now there is freedom and salvation. So take some time to consider today, what are some of those physical sufferings you're feeling? What are some of the effects of sin you see in your life and your heart that bear itself physically? And give thanks that those aren't a sign of God's punishment, but rather they're a sign of the effects of sin and that yet the freedom that we have in Christ.